brutal snowstorm raged across the countryside, blanketing everything in a blinding white. In the dead of winter, when the icy winds showed no mercy, a lone figure emerged from the storm. It was a German shepherd, frozen, trembling, his paws bleeding from the relentless cold. He collapsed near the edge of a barn, hidden behind stacks of firewood, seeking even the faintest shelter from the biting wind. The farmer, out checking on his livestock, spotted the lifeless shape buried in snow and froze. What he did next would leave everyone speechless. Was it fate that brought them together? Or something greater? This is a story of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a dog. Before we dive into this emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to never miss another inspiring story like this. The storm had been relentless for days. Thick snow covered the ground, muffling every sound except for the howling wind. Henry Moore, a weathered farmer in his late 50s, stepped out of his house, bundled in layers of wool and a thick coat. His breath formed icy clouds as he trudged toward the barn to check on the livestock. The cold bit through his gloves, and every step felt heavier as the snow reached up to his knees. As he rounded the barn, Henry noticed something unusual. A faint shadow at the edge of the woodpile. His heart sank when he got closer and saw the figure. It was a dog, barely recognizable under the layers of frost clinging to its fur. Its ribs were visible, and its breathing was shallow, each exhale forming a weak puff of vapor in the frigid air. Henry knelt down, his gloved hand hovering uncertainly over the dog's body. "How on earth did you get here, boy?" he murmured, his voice trembling as much from shock as from the cold. The dog didn't move, its eyes barely flickering open to acknowledge him. The sight was heartbreaking, a proud-looking German shepherd reduced to this fragile state. Without hesitation, Henry pulled off his scarf and wrapped it around the dog's frozen body. The fur was stiff with ice, and its paws were cracked and bleeding. He picked the dog up, cradling it against his chest as he hurried back to the barn. His steps quickened, slipping on the icy ground, but he held the dog tightly, determined not to let it slip away. Inside the barn, the warmth from the animals offered a reprieve from the icy storm. Henry laid the dog gently on a bed of hay and fetched a heavy blanket from the loft. He wrapped the dog securely, then ran to fetch a bucket of warm water. His hands shook as he worked to clean the ice and snow from the dog's fur, careful not to cause it more pain. The dog whimpered softly, its eyes half closed, but there was a flicker of trust in its gaze, a fragile thread of hope. Henry spoke softly as he worked, his voice a soothing balm against the chaos of the storm. "You've been through hell, haven't you? Don't worry, boy. You're safe now." Once the dog was cleaned and bundled, Henry sat beside it, stroking its head gently. He could feel the faint rise and fall of its chest, a sign that it was still fighting to survive. As the storm raged outside, Henry stayed with the dog, his heart heavy with questions. Where had it come from? How long had it been out there? And, most importantly, would it survive? The storm howled through the night, but in that barn, amidst the warmth of the animals and the quiet care of a farmer, the fragile connection between man and dog began to grow. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick clouds as Henry opened the barn door. The storm had passed, but the air was still frigid, and the snow outside glistened like a frozen sea. He approached the German shepherd, still wrapped in the heavy blanket, its breathing shallow but steady. For a brief moment, Henry allowed himself to feel hope. The dog had made it through the night, but just barely. Henry crouched beside the dog, his weathered hands gently lifting its head. "Good morning, boy," he said softly, though the dog's ears barely twitched in response. Its eyes opened weakly, locking onto his for the first time. There was something haunting in that gaze, an unspoken story of suffering and resilience. Henry knew the dog needed more than warmth to survive. He rummaged through the barn storage and found an old bowl, filling it with lukewarm water. "Drink up," he coaxed, holding the bowl close. The dog hesitated before its dry, cracked tongue lapped at the water, each sip a small victory. Next came food. Henry scoured his kitchen, finding scraps of cooked chicken and a piece of bread. He tore them into tiny pieces and brought them back to the barn, offering the meal in small increments. The dog ate cautiously, its movements slow and deliberate as though even the simple act of chewing required more energy than it could spare. But it ate, and that was enough for Henry to feel a flicker of relief. As the day wore on, Henry returned to his usual farm chores, though his mind kept wandering back to the barn. He wondered if the dog belonged to someone, if its owners were out there searching. But the closest town was nearly 20 miles away, and the harsh storm had made the roads impassable. For now, the dog was his responsibility, and he wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. By late afternoon, Henry returned to check on his unexpected guest. The dog's breathing was stronger, its eyes more alert. It even attempted to lift its head as he approached, though it quickly gave up and laid back down. "That's it, boy," Henry said with a small smile. "You're a fighter." Henry spent the evening in the barn, repairing an old wooden crate to use as a makeshift bed. He padded it with hay and blankets, creating a warm, secure spot for the dog. As he worked, he talked to it, sharing bits of his life. "Lost my wife a few years back," he said quietly. "It's just me and this farm now. Gets lonely sometimes. Maybe you were sent here to change that, huh?" The dog watched him, its ears twitching slightly at the sound of his voice. Henry wasn't sure if it understood him, but talking made the silence feel less heavy. It also gave him something to hold on to, a bond forming between him and the animal that had stumbled into his life. By nightfall, the dog's condition had improved enough that it managed to lift its head and sniff at Henry's hand. The gesture was subtle but powerful, and Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He knelt beside the crate, his voice soft and full of warmth. "You're going to make it. I promise." As he closed the barn door that night, Henry glanced back at the German Shepherd, now resting more comfortably in its new bed. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that the dog might survive, but he also knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, and neither of them would come out of it unchanged. The next morning brought a glimmer of hope. The German Shepherd greeted Henry with a faint wag of its tail as he entered the barn, a small but undeniable sign of life. Henry's heart swelled at the sight. "Well, look at you," he said with a chuckle, crouching down beside the crate. "Starting to feel a little better, huh?" The dog's eyes were more alert now, though its body was still frail. Henry reached out carefully, his hand hovering near its head. This time, the dog didn't flinch. Instead, it nudged its nose against his palm. The simple gesture felt monumental, a sign of trust that made Henry's chest tighten with emotion. Henry went about his morning chores with a renewed sense of purpose. He brought a fresh bucket of water and another modest meal for the dog, watching as it ate with more vigor than the day before. Its movements were still slow, but the improvement was undeniable. "You're tougher than you look," Henry remarked, pulling up an old wooden stool to sit beside the dog. "Guess that makes two of us." He couldn't help but smile as the dog lifted its head to meet his gaze. For the first time in years, Henry felt something stir within him, a sense of companionship that he hadn't realized he missed so deeply. Despite the dog's progress, Henry knew there were questions that needed answering. Where had it come from? Who had left it to fend for itself in such brutal conditions? The thought of someone abandoning such a beautiful animal made his blood boil. He decided that if no one came looking for it, he'd take the dog in himself. It wasn't as though the farm couldn't use an extra pair of watchful eyes. As the day wore on, Henry worked on repairing the barn roof, all the while keeping an ear out for any sounds from the crate. Every so often, he would glance down, relieved to see the dog resting peacefully. He couldn't shake the feeling that this animal was meant to find him, that their paths had crossed for a reason. By afternoon, Henry decided it was time to name the dog. "Can't keep calling you boy," he said as he leaned against the barn door, studying the dog's alert eyes and strong, though weakened, frame. "How about Max? You look like a Max to me." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of its new name, and Henry grinned. "Max it is, then." The name felt right, and with it came a sense of permanence, as though the dog had already claimed its place in Henry's life. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Henry brought Max outside for the first time since the storm. The air was still bitterly cold, but the snow had settled, and the world was eerily quiet. Max took a tentative step forward, his legs shaky but determined. Henry stayed close, his hand hovering just in case the dog faltered. "You've got a lot of fight in you," Henry said as Max sniffed the snow-covered ground. For the first time in days, Henry felt a flicker of optimism, not just for the dog's recovery, but for himself. Max wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, and that resilience was contagious. Later that evening, as Henry prepared for bed, he couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of purpose. Max's presence had brought a warmth back to the farmhouse that had been missing for years. And though their journey together was just beginning, Henry knew one thing for certain. They had already saved each other in ways neither could fully understand. But as Henry drifted off to sleep, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. The storm had taken a toll on the land, and the farm was already struggling to stay afloat. Could he provide for both of them in the long term? And if Max's past came knocking, would he be able to let him go? The next morning, Henry awoke to the sound of soft scratching at his front door. Startled, he rushed to open it and found Max standing there, tail wagging slightly, his strength clearly improving. The sight brought a smile to Henry's face. "Well, I'll be," he said with a chuckle. "Looks like you're feeling bold today." Henry let Max inside and watched as the dog cautiously explored the small, rustic farmhouse. Max's nose twitched as he sniffed at the furniture and the faint scent of breakfast lingering in the air. For the first time, Henry realized how much life Max's presence added to his home. It had been years since the place felt this alive. After breakfast, Henry decided to take Max out to explore the property. He grabbed an old leash he'd found in the barn and looped it gently around Max's neck. "Let's see how you do outside, huh?" he said, leading the dog out into the crisp morning air. The snow was still thick, crunching under their boots and paws as they walked. Max's steps were cautious at first, his weakened legs trembling slightly. But with each passing minute, his confidence grew. He began to sniff the ground more intently, his ears perking up at every sound. Henry couldn't help but marvel at the dog's resilience. Max had been at death's door just days ago, yet here he was, walking beside him like a loyal companion. "You're a tough one, Max," Henry said, patting the dog's head. "Guess we've got that in common." As they made their way toward the edge of the property, Max suddenly froze. His body tensed, ears erect, and his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Henry followed his line of sight and saw what had caught Max's attention: a fox darting across the snow-covered field. Before Henry could react, Max lunged forward, the leash pulling taut in Henry's hands. "Whoa, easy," he called out, struggling to hold onto the leash as Max strained against it. The dog barked, his instincts clearly kicking in, but Henry's firm voice eventually brought him back. "Max, no," he said sternly, kneeling to meet the dog's gaze. "You can't go running off like that." Max whined softly, his tail dropping as if he understood the scolding. Henry sighed, his hand gently ruffling the fur on Max's neck. "It's okay, boy. You're just not used to this yet. We'll get there." The incident left Henry thinking about how much work still lay ahead. Max's instincts were strong, too strong for a dog that had likely been domesticated at some point. It was clear he had either been on his own for far too long or had come from a past that encouraged such behavior. Either way, Max needed guidance, and Henry was determined to provide it. That afternoon, Henry began working with Max in the barn, using small commands to teach him basic obedience. "Sit," he said firmly, holding a treat in his hand. Max tilted his head, his expressive eyes studying Henry, as if trying to decipher the meaning of the word. After a few tries, Max finally sat down, earning himself the treat and a hearty pat on the head. "Good boy," Henry said, grinning. "You're a quick learner, aren't you?" The training sessions continued throughout the day, with Max picking up on commands faster than Henry had expected. Each small success strengthened the bond between them, and by evening, Max was following Henry around the farm as though he had been there his whole life. But as the sun set and the farm grew quiet, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was fragile. Max's presence had brought joy and purpose back into his life, but it had also brought questions. Where had Max come from? What had he endured to end up on Henry's doorstep? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, would someone come looking for him? As Henry settled in for the night, Max curled up on an old rug near the fireplace. The dog's eyes closed, his breathing steady and content. Henry watched him for a moment, a sense of unease tugging at the edges of his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: Max had become more than just a dog to him. He was family. The next morning, Henry was greeted by Max at the door, his tail wagging with newfound energy. The transformation in just a few days was remarkable. Max was eating well, responding to commands, and growing more comfortable in his new environment. But as Henry admired the progress, he couldn't ignore the lingering question, where had Max come from? After breakfast, Henry decided to do something he had been avoiding. He examined Max more closely, running his hands gently over the dog's fur. Near the base of Max's neck, he found what he was dreading, a faint scar, as if a collar had once been worn too tightly. His heart sank. Max hadn't just been lost. He had been abandoned, or worse, mistreated. "Someone didn't take care of you, did they, boy?" Henry said, his voice heavy with emotion. Max looked up at him, his eyes full of trust that only deepened Henry's resolve. "Well, they don't deserve you. You're safe now." Later that afternoon, as Henry worked on repairing a broken fence, a truck pulled into the long dirt driveway leading to the farmhouse. Henry's stomach tightened. Visitors were rare out here, and unannounced ones even rarer. Max, sensing the change in Henry's demeanor, trotted to his side, his posture alert but calm. A man stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a heavy coat, with a stern expression that immediately put Henry on edge. "Afternoon," the man called out, his eyes scanning the property before landing on Max. Henry stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the man and the dog. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone guarded. The man nodded toward Max. "Heard from the folks in town you might have found a dog after the storm." "That him?" Henry's heart pounded. He knew where this was going, and he didn't like it. "He showed up here, yeah, in rough shape. Took me a couple of days to nurse him back." The man crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "That's my dog. Been looking for him." Max, as if sensing the tension, pressed closer to Henry's side. Henry's jaw tightened. "Funny," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You don't look like you've been taking care of him. He was half frozen and starving when I found him." The man bristled. "He ran off during the storm. Things happen." Henry looked down at Max, who was watching the man intently, his tail stiff and unmoving. "I don't think he wants to go back with you," Henry said firmly. The man stepped closer, his voice rising. "Look, I don't know what you think, but that's my property. You've got no right to keep him." Henry squared his shoulders, his own voice hardening. "You can call him property all you want, but he's alive. He's a soul, and it's clear you didn't treat him like one." The man opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Max let out a low growl, his body tense. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You'll be hearing from me," he said coldly, before turning and climbing back into his truck. The vehicle kicked up a cloud of dust as it sped away. Henry exhaled deeply, his hands trembling. He knelt down beside Max, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Don't you worry, boy," he said softly. "I'm not letting anyone take you away." That evening, as Henry sat by the fire with Max at his feet, he couldn't shake the encounter. He knew the man's threat wasn't idle, and he worried about what might come next. But one thing was certain, he wasn't about to let Max go without a fight. For the first time in years, Henry had something worth fighting for, and he wouldn't let it be taken from him. Max wasn't just a stray dog who had stumbled onto his property. He was family now, and Henry would do whatever it took to keep him safe. The next morning, Henry woke with a sense of unease. The man's visit lingered in his mind like a storm cloud, and he knew it wouldn't be the last he'd see of him. As the sun rose over the snowy fields, Henry glanced at Max, who lay curled up near the fireplace, his eyes half open and alert. Henry gave him a reassuring pat. "We'll handle it, boy, together." Midway through the morning, as Henry was tending to his livestock, the sound of an engine rumbling up the driveway sent his heart racing. He wiped his hands on his coat and walked outside, finding the same truck parked in front of the house. This time, the man wasn't alone. Another man, larger and equally stern-faced, stood beside him. Henry approached with deliberate steps, his jaw set. Max appeared at his side, his ears erect and his stance protective. "Back again," Henry called out, keeping his voice steady. The first man stepped forward, his tone colder than before. I told you, that dog's mine. I'm not leaving without him. Henry crossed his arms, standing his ground. I'm telling you, you abandoned him. He doesn't want to go with you, and I won't let you take him. The larger man sneered. You think you can stop us, old man? You don't have any proof he belongs to you. Henry felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't back down. I don't need proof. I've got him, he said, gesturing to Max. Look at him. Does he look like he trusts you? Does he even recognize you? Max growled softly, his body tense but controlled. The men exchanged a glance, clearly unnerved by the dog's protective demeanor. Listen, Henry continued, his voice firm. You've got two choices. You can leave now, and we'll forget this ever happened. Or you can try to take him and find out just how much fight I've got left in me. The first man took a step closer, but before he could say anything, Max barked sharply, stepping forward to place himself between Henry and the strangers. His bark wasn't just a sound, it was a warning, a declaration of loyalty that left no room for argument. The men hesitated, their bravado faltering under Max's unwavering gaze. Finally, the larger man muttered something under his breath and turned back toward the truck. He's not worth the trouble, he said gruffly. The first man lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Henry. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. But as Max let out another growl, the man finally relented, climbing into the truck. With a spray of gravel and snow, they drove off. Henry stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline coursing through him. When the truck disappeared down the road, he let out a shaky breath and crouched down beside Max, wrapping his arms around the dog. You did good, boy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're safe now. I promise. In the days that followed, Henry didn't see the men again. He fortified the barn and the fences around his property, unwilling to take any chances. But with each passing day, his worries began to ease. Max was thriving, his strength and energy returning in full. The bond between them grew stronger, and Henry found himself smiling more often than he had in years. One quiet evening, as Henry sat by the fire with Max resting at his feet, he reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. Max had entered his world like a storm, bringing chaos and uncertainty, but he had also brought purpose, loyalty, and an unwavering sense of companionship. Henry reached down, running his fingers through Max's thick fur. You saved me as much as I saved you, he said softly. Max looked up at him, his eyes full of understanding. In that moment, Henry knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The snow outside began to melt as the season shifted, a symbol of the new chapter in Henry's life. Max wasn't just a stray dog anymore, he was family. And for the first time in years, Henry felt whole. Max and Henry's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about rediscovering hope and finding a bond that neither of them knew they needed. From the frozen storm to the threats from strangers, they stood by each other, proving that courage and loyalty could overcome even the harshest challenges. Max wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable connection between a man and his best friend. If this story touched your heart, remember, life has a way of bringing us exactly what we need when we least expect it. Don't let go of the moments or the bonds that make us stronger. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and loyalty. Together, let's spread the message that love and compassion can overcome anything. Thank you for watching.